we have worked with the AGA and others to bring Dennis in all the way from Singapore. I took him into the Climatron yesterday, and he said he felt very much at home. I was hoping to show him something new, but no, just typical everyday plants for them. Dennis is a phenomenal expert. You guys know Andre in the club. We think of him as the expert, but he learns so much from Dennis. Dennis was just speaking at the Aquatic Gardens Association in North Carolina earlier this month and has been traveling around the U.S. because we weren't the only ones that got in. But if you haven't been to his website, 2HR Aquarist, you'll find an incredible amount of information, a lot of things that you don't hear as much about or hear incorrect information about on a lot of the YouTube channels and other folks about bringing the reds out in plants and nitrate limitations, and also some very successful strategies to defeat algae. I'm reading on some computer screen. About that on his website as well. So please welcome all the way from Singapore to Maasai, Dennis Wong.
Thanks, guys. I come all the way from Singapore. I think some of you may not know me as well, so I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I don't do any conservation work. I'm not a biologist. I'm purely a hobbyist, and I also have a commercial venture. But I come as someone that, I guess I'll say that I'm an expert on growing more picky species. And I think a few species that I'm known for, I have to brag a little bit, so I apologize. I was the first one in the world to grow this species. It's called Hygrophila sp. chai. It originated as a mutation from the lab in Singapore, but the farm could not grow it underwater. So they kept the mutation in immersed form for years. Finally, they passed a sample to me, asked, can you try to grow this underwater? And I did. And once I was successful, they then could sell it commercially. Urocolon cuspidatum. This was collected by one of the US collectors, Vin. I think some of you know him. He has relatives in Singapore, so he passed me a sample. Then I grew it out and I passed the sample on to Tomba. So if you own this plant in the US, the original stock probably came from my tank. I'm also known for popularizing certain species in the hobby. So those of you using the Rotala blood red version that stays very red quite easily, it probably came from originally from my tank samples in Singapore. And I also popularized this, the purple Bacopa sample. The original Bacopa Salzmani, the leaves were not so purple and the stem was green. I discovered, or rather I popularized this variant that in Singapore, and so they named it, you'll see the SG tag if you get this. And the other plant that I think I'm quite linked to is the brownie ghost. This is a Bucephalandra collected from Indonesia, but the location has been lost to, due to them clearing the land for palm plantations. In the past, I think one rhizome was like 100 USD. Then I sent the samples overseas, and now I think that many folks here have it too. I'm more known for my work with this Dutch, loosely called Dutch style planted tanks where there's no hardscape and we just grow colorful species. But I also do quite a bit of work in aquascaping. In some of the other areas I've been to in the US, I conduct courses on how to do these aquascapes. I'm also tied to this company, Aquarist, which I founded just a few years back. I think some of you guys here use my products. And to me, founding the Aquarist was a very interesting way to gather data because I could see how people all over the world work with these parameters that I gave them through my products. And this also allowed me to collect information on how to grow difficult species overseas because folks will ask me, I want to have tanks like yours. Now I'm using your products. Can you guide me on how to get such tanks? And over the last few years, I've refined some of the principles that I will explain in my video here so that you guys too can have grow these difficult species with ease. So rather than telling you guys what works for me, I would rather tell you what works for the average person because depending on my skill set and my access to certain tools that the average hobbyist does not have, what works for me might work quite differently for others. And I know that the methodologies that I explained will work because Aquarist has a list of ambassadors all over the globe, and we have been able to replicate the growing of difficult species quite easily. And in many of these countries, the hobbies, well, they are not so educated like you guys. Yeah. So, like this guy in Philippines, when he had this tank, he didn't know the difference between KH and GH, for example. Yeah. And this also demonstrates that you do not need a huge amount of technical knowledge to actually grow difficult stuff. You just have to hit the few important factors that I will describe in this video. So what makes a species difficult? Some species may require more light, more fertilizer, more carbon dioxide, and some species have very specific requirements. A lot of the difficult species require soft water, and some species are sensitive. The sensitive species tend to be mutations that occur in the lab that you don't find in nature, such as the pink plant you saw in the first slide. This is a light meter. I think that if you only keep fish, you will not be using this instrument because it's quite costly. But what this does is that it measures the amount of light that the plant receives where the sensor is. And I think the first thing that divides the easier or more difficult plants is that a lot of the more difficult plants require a lot more light to grow. If I use a tank with mostly easy plants, such as mosses and nubias, I can grow it with as little as 40 U-moles of par. This is the unit that we use to measure the amount of light. And for a tank with moss and crypts, I could run as low as 20 U-moles of par. So these two are the non-CO2 injected tanks that I have. However, when growing a tank that has more demanding species, we can use actually up to 10 times the amount of light. So in lighting the tank, the difference between a low demand tank and a high demand tank can be huge. In this case, it's more than 10 times the amount of light difference used. This is an example of the light gradient in my tank. The top layers that are closer to the light will receive about 400 par. In the past, it was difficult to achieve such high light levels through just the fluorescent tubing. But with today's new LED lights, I think that the average Chihiro's Twin Star weak aqua light that you buy out there, you can hit these light levels quite easily. In fact, I would think a lot of the consumer lighting today are too powerful for the average hobbyist. So what you see is people will buy a Chihiro's light, but they will tune it down to like 10% because they are only growing low light plants. Lighting also affects color rendition a lot. So for this tank, I use a couple of household lights in the office to just show you how different it looks. So even though it is 6500K, a lot of the LEDs are deficient in the red spectrum. So this actually doesn't mirror sunlight. The color tone mirrors sunlight when you put it on the Kelvin scale. But this is not reflective of, I call it the true colors of the plants as well. Under sunlight, the tank will be somewhere in the middle between these two. You will get better rates, but not as high saturation as some of the LEDs. I think that many of the commercial LEDs have quite well-tuned spectrum, where we can get very good saturation of colors, and yet the background is still white. In the past, you will see like tanks that grow colorful plants use this very purplish lighting in order to bring out the coloration. Today, we can achieve it with relatively white lighting. And I think that that's one of the best advances in light technology in the recent years. This is an example of a plant that is a classic high demand plant. This is the red Eurocolon. Does anyone here have it in his tank? Just out of curiosity, you? Yeah. So if you can grow this plant, chances are you can grow any plant on the market. Right. So this is a very classic plant that requires high light, high CO2, good level of fertilization. If this grows in your tank, virtually any other species on the commercial market will grow. It also requires soft water. And for this plant, I've not seen it grow in a non-CO2 tank anywhere else in the world. So I think that its requirement for CO2 is one of the hard lines in the sand. If you don't hit that CO2 level, it does not survive. Some species require soft water. I think you guys will be familiar with the various Eurycalons, Tonina species as well. These are two families that if you cannot fulfill the requirement for soft water, your chances of growing it is greatly diminished. I think around above 3 or 4 DKH, it basically does not survive. So these are strictly soft water plants. On the flip side, we have some other plants that actually do quite well with harder water. This might come as a surprise to some people who have not tried this. Many crypts, including the crypt flamingo, they actually grow better in hard water. They are more stable in harder water. And Rotala florida, which was collected in the US, is another species that grows more stable in hard water compared to soft. Next, we have some species that are particularly sensitive. So these are all, I call them mutations of standard plants. This is the mini butterfly, and this is the Rotala mini type 2. There are various Rotala minis on the market, and most of them are quite unstable. So if you don't grow it well, the leaf will morph back to looking like another plant. It looks completely different. I don't have a picture of the reverted form. For these plants, they like a very stable environment. Jacking up the parameters too high or low will cause them to change. So interestingly, I find that for these two species, rather than just blasting it with as much light and fertilizer as possible, growing them in the middle range with middle amount of light, with a stable but low range of fertilization actually produce more consistent results. So it is not true that for growing difficult plants, you just throw as much light, fertilizer, and CO2 as much as possible. Next, I'll go through the steps of how do I set up my tanks to grow this more challenging species. I think that the first step, which is tuning your parameters, is actually the easiest one. I think that it's easy because these are hard targets. So if you use RO water and you remineralize with GH and KH salts, you can enter the target range. So there's no judgment call, right? So you just hit the parameters and it works. The interesting combination that works for many of these difficult plants is a high GH but low KH. So this is weird because in nature, you seldom get this combination. In nature, when your GH is high, your KH tend to be high because this means that the water has flowed through some limestone and you get a bit of both carbonates as well as calcium. But we can get this artificially by using RO water, which has nothing. And we add GH booster to get a high GH, but we don't add any KH. So basically your water is super soft, but it has quite a lot of calcium, quite a bit of magnesium. So this weird combi works extremely well for many difficult species. The pH is actually not very important. I think the tanks can range between pH 4 and 7, so that's quite a large range. And for most species, even if your soil and your water is very acidic, they actually do quite okay. This is a very common temperature range. And for light, I think about 150 par is the sweet spot for those of you who are targeting a specific light level. Above 200 par, I think that algae becomes difficult to manage. And if you fall below 100, the growth factor is not strong enough to grow certain species well. And for TDS, it's not particularly important. So I've seen tanks that range from 100 to like 400. And you can grow everything you see in this picture in that range.
Yeah, so
Yes.
Pause, I just wanted to point out, so the club does own a par meter. It's a relatively expensive piece of equipment. And Andre, wave your hand, you are in charge of checking that out if folks are interested. You need to be a paid, up-to-date NASA member to check it out.
The par meter is a very useful instrument. It lets you know certain interesting things, such as the par on this surface, for example, might be 300, but just slightly into the shade here, the par can drop by like 90%. So our eyes can be quite deceiving because our eyes compensate for the different light levels quite easily. The par on the table surface, for example, my estimation will be about 3 to 4, given a well-lit room. Whereas the sunlight outside, it'll be about 1,000 par over if there's a clear sky. So the range that our eyes can see is huge, from like 0 to 1,000. So when you look at your tanks, it can be quite hard to judge exactly how bright it is. What fertilizer range? I think that there is too much discussion on this topic. So if you go online and you try to Google for how to grow difficult plants, immediately people say that you need this amount of potassium, this amount of nitrates, this amount of phosphates. But from my experience and my experimentation with other people's tank is that most plants scavenge nutrients very well. And most of these difficult plants actually grow in a very wide range of nutrient values. This is the amount that Tom Barr doses in his tank per week. Right, so 30 ppm, if he dose every day, it'll be 30 divided by 7. If he dose it 3 times a week, he'll be dosing 10 ppm of nitrates per week into this tank. I dose much less. So compared to him, I root feed my plants a lot more. But both of us can basically grow any species on the market. And you can go lower value than this for many species as well. So I think that people tend to overthink nutrients. And in some cases, you can actually dose too much. For folks that have tried growing the sensitive species such as Armenia and Rotalas, if you dose too much, you actually get tip stunting. So this, on the right side, is a well-grown specimen. On the left, to induce this, I can actually have a nitrate spike, or I can have a spike in my iron or trace levels. And this is an example where of Rotala macandra narrow leaf that is grown well. And this is one where I have overdosed the traces to get the tips to stun. So generally, consistency is important, but you do not need a huge amount of nutrients to grow such plants. Lowering the certain nutrients also give us different color effects on certain species. So this is the common Rotala rotundifolia. This is Rotala hora. If you grow it under higher nitrate levels, it becomes more orange. I think if your nitrate levels are really high and your light is low, you actually get it to go green. Whereas if your nitrates bottom out, you can get it to go completely red. This is Ludwigia acuta. In most low light tanks that have more nitrates, it will be yellow. But if you grow it with low nitrates and high light, you can get it blood red. This is a statement I like to tell people when they overanalyze fertilizers. A lot of people tweak fertilizers when they fail to diagnose problems in other areas. And I think fertilizer tweaking is very attractive, right? Because it's something we have a lot of control over. But it's often the factors that we have less control over that affects the plant growth. Again, the statement I like is when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And I think hobbyists like to tweak the parameters they can measure, right? So they like to tweak the light, they like to tweak the fertilizer, but because they don't have good tools to measure the carbon dioxide, a lot of people tend to not pay so much attention to it. There are other factors that are less perceivable, such as plant positioning in the tank, intra-species competition. All these play a very large role in determining your success as well. What substrate is best? I think that for the older folks here who have kept tanks, planted tanks since the 80s, 90s, I think everyone started with more inert substrates. I think like Aquasoil only became popular in the 90s or in the late 2000s. But Aquasoil offers a lot of benefit. And the primary one that it offers is ammoniacal nitrogen through the substrate zone. And plants generally prefer to uptake ammonia as a nitrogen source compared to nitrates. For nitrates, they actually have to reduce it back to ammonia within the plant for it to be synthesized. So this is an example where I grow Ludwigia pantanal. It's deemed to be quite a high demand plant, but my water column residual nitrate level is near 0. This is an example where this guy, he does very heavy water column dosing. He has 15 to 20 ppm of nitrates in his tank, 15 to 20 ppm of potassium, but his looks skinny, right? So water dosing alone doesn't get the fullest form for many of the more picky species. Having ammoniacal nitrogen in the substrate makes a big impact, and the substrate that can give that is aqua soil. Raw soil also works. Like you can do this with garden soil, but the difficulty about doing that is that it's a non-uniform product. Yeah, so though, unless you know how to tweak the raw soil, you can have other side effects, unintended side effects in the tank. This is an example of Ludwigia senegalensis. So this is a very common plant, but to grow it with its very full form, I think that you need soil. Typically it looks like this. You see a lot more green in the veins, and the leaves don't get as full. Many Eurocolons feed very well from aqua soil as well, so you get thicker leaves and you get much faster growth. This is quite a common plant, the mini type 4. With ammonium nitrogen, you have much fuller leaves. The typical form is a bit skinnier. Yeah. Does anyone grow this plant? Again, Andre. Does yours look like this or this? Yeah? You see the difference in your own tank? Yes. Yeah.
Learn a lot from your approach.
Also, this is an interesting question. Which species here require more CO2 than the rest? It's a bit small, but you guys can take a guess. Carpet comes close. That's the second most CO2 demanding species in there. You need sharp eyes. It's a bit small. Anyone else want to take a guess? So sometimes it can be hard to tell. So there's a bit of Rotala florida in here. And it is one species that does, again, better with a bit or quite a bit higher CO2 levels. Everything else in the tank can be grown fine with a low level. I think that when it comes to data on many of these picky species, it's difficult to find this information. Yeah. And depending on whether you want to grow that one difficult species in a tank, the requirements of your tank change a lot. So sometimes the question is, are you changing your entire tank system just to accommodate one difficult species, right? And sometimes it may not be worth it because some species require a lot of light. If you're keeping sensitive fish, you may not want to inject so much CO2. So there are trade-offs with trying to grow this difficult species. This is an example where if you try to grow HC and you don't have enough CO2, it grows upwards and you get smaller leaves. For the same species, this is standard Rotala rotandifolia. Having adequate CO2 also induces more branching. So you can immediately tell tanks that have CO2 because of the density in growth. While many species can be grown without CO2, it just doesn't get as dense. You don't get as much side shoots of your stems. And your leaves are generally a bit thinner as well. So how do we inject CO2 optimally? In a perfect world, what we want is once we start injecting CO2, it very quickly reaches the ideal level and then it tapers off. But in most tanks, this doesn't happen. In most tanks, you either inject heavily and then you get too high injection rate, then you see your fish start surfacing. And you can try to hit the taper point slowly, but then it takes many hours. So how do we flatten the curve? How do we get this quick saturation and flatten off? And we can get that by having higher off-gassing. So this is a weird concept for folks that have not done CO2 injection. Because if you're injecting CO2, why would you want to off-gas it? Right? It's counterintuitive. But if you think about the glass box, your tank, as an enclosed system, and you are injecting CO2, the maximum rate at which you can inject is the rate that is off-gases. Right? If the maximum rate that you are injecting is not the rate of gas, that means it is building up in the system. So for it to have a high equilibrium rate, your off-gassing actually has to be quite high. And this is the most counterintuitive point on CO2 injection, I think. And it takes people a while to realize that, oh, it does work this way. So how do you have a high off-gassing? Firstly, you have a clean water surface. In my tanks, I use a surface skimmer. So most planted tanks, if you have a large enough plum mass, the plum metabolites actually create the surface film. So this is something you might not see in a low-tech tank, where your plants are growing slowly. But in a high-tech tank where you drive plant growth hard, a lot of the waste metabolites will form the surface film. So you can have the surface film even in a tank with no fish. So basically the metabolites come from the plants themselves. And the next is to have a circulation pattern that exchanges the top layer with the deeper layers in the tank. For off-gassing, it only happens at the water surface. So if you have a flow format where the top continues to circulate by itself and the bottom circulate by itself, there's no exchange. And you don't get good off-gassing in the bottom layers. So to get good off-gassing, we want to exchange the top layer with the deeper layers in the tank. If you do this, it's actually quite hard to inject enough CO2 to gas your fish. Yeah. So for those of you who have fish problems when you inject CO2, the way to combat it is not to inject less, but to improve your off-gassing. If you have good off-gassing, it's actually really quite hard to gas your fish. How do you gauge CO2 levels? Drop checkers are okay for the regular plants, but if you're trying to hit that magical 35 to 40 ppm of CO2, then they are too coarse a gauge. They're not precise. And they are prone to errors. So for example, this guy, he placed his drop checker too far up the tank. It's going to capture the CO2 bubbles, so he'll get a false reading. A good method that I think that is available to hobbyists, because the alternative method is to have a pH probe, and that costs about 1.5K, I think, yeah, to 2,000. Yeah, so we have that in the office, but for hobbyists, you can use a pH meter to take the pH difference between when the water is saturated and compared to when the water is not saturated. So for example, in my tank, the pH with CO2 on drops to pH 5. I'll take a cup of the water out of this tank, I'll shake it to off-gas the CO2, and if I stir it for a couple of minutes, I'll see the pH starting to rise, and it should rise above 6 in this example. So you see a 1 pH swing. For most people, your tanks will not fully off-gas throughout the night. So if you inject CO2, even if you measure it when CO2 is off for a few hours, the pH will still be suppressed. Yeah, most people don't realize this. So they think that when the CO2 is off, all the CO2 escapes in the next 10 hours or so, but it doesn't. It takes quite a bit of off-gassing to off-gas the CO2. I'll talk a little bit about plant layout and how it can affect success rates. This is actually a bad layout. Yeah, so this is not a good example. And why is that this very light demanding plant is being shaded by the more aggressive growers? So I think that a lot of people lose sensitive species when they have other plants that crowd them out. And aquatic plants grow quite fast if you drive them hard. So the overcrowding occurs quite quickly. So this is a negative example. This is also a negative example. So this guy, he didn't do a very smart thing when he mixed the shade plants with plants that require a lot of light. So I tried mixing Anubias white with chai because I wanted the color contrast. But this is a very troublesome combination to manage. Basically, this plant requires 5 times as much light as this plant. So by the time these plants grow well, these plants are more vulnerable to algae. So this is also not a good example. So this example is okay. What I've done here is that I've used this slower growing species, Bucephalandra, Blixia, Crepe flamingo, this lobelia. They are used as a shield to block off the faster growing stem plants from my carpets and my aerials. So this is one way you can arrange your tank. Use the slower growing species as a wall against the faster growing species and put your delicate species in front. Interesting thing about the front glass is that because of the way light reflects, the maximum amount of light that the plants receive will be the first 2 inches against the glass. Because of the way the light rays reflect, there'll be a spike of about 20% light in the first 2 inches of your front glass. This layout is also okay. Here I've used rocks to shield the delicate plants from the stem plants at the back. And I've picked species that can be overcrowded as the intermediaries. So the flamingo can be shaded a bit and you'll be fine. And some species are sensitive, but they don't mind a bit of shading. So I'll use those in between the plants that require more light and the sensitive species in front. So here are my carpet of blood vomit that is totally protected with the rockwork. So it shields the faster growing plant from overcrowding it. Oh, this is for the previous slide. Yeah, so if you have fish gasping, tune up your gaseous exchange. For those of you trying to hit the 1 pH drop, I think that the amount of bubbles that you see in your bubble counter will actually be quite scary. Yeah, most people don't run tanks at that rate. So if you try to compare it with hobbies online, everyone will be like, wow, that's a lot of bubbles. Yeah. For low pH, it's fine for salt water. So if you keep hard water fishes, then you can't do this method. Yeah. For a lot of the tanks that use aqua soy with CO2 injection, the pH drops into the 4+ range. So I've seen tanks as low as 4.5, 4.6. Things start to get weird as you approach 4. Yeah, but most tanks don't hit that boundary. I'll say that most tanks fall to around 5+. Next, I'll move on to talk a bit about algae. And I think algae is a topic that is the most time-wasting element of the hobby, right? So people want to master it so that they can get to the more interesting stuff. But algae is also a complex organism. And I think that too many people try to define it in very clear variables, like, oh, you inject this amount of CO2, and this disappears. And most of the time, it doesn't work so linearly. As an organism that has survived for millions of years, it tries to find its way around. I'll show you a couple of techniques to mitigate it. The first one is what I call fighting algae through plant mass. So how does this work? We start with an algae filled tank. So this is my tank. This one, I started it without cycling the tank beforehand. So I get the usual diatoms. This usually comes after 2 weeks. So I think that for a lot of people that start their first planted tank, nothing will happen for the first week. So they get this false sense of security. Then after 2 weeks, after the algae has multiplied, suddenly they get these strands of brown. Then they get shocked. And a lot of folks think that, oh, maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I should restart the tank. But this is actually a very normal progression. So start with algae filled tank. However, when we look at the plants in that tank, we realize that algae is not everywhere. Algae is usually on the older leaves, and it is not on the newer leaves. And this is a sign that your plant is adapting to the environment. And in that adaptation, the plant will take energy from the older leaves and channel it to the newer leaves. And it will actually produce protective chemicals in the new growth, and that keeps the new growth algae free. So a plant that is growing healthy, that has enough energy to produce the protective chemicals, will always be algae free. And we can see this when we buy plant back from other people's tank as well. When you transfer a plant into your tank, it has to adapt. And in the adaptation process, it channels energy to new growth. The new growth will have machinery that makes use of your tank parameters in the most optimal way possible. But the old growth has limited plasticity. So the old growth cannot heal. And I think that for many first-time plant growers, they do not realize this. So they do something that improves tank growth, like they add CO2 or they have a better light. And they ask, why is my plant not doing well? Why is it not improving? That's because the old growth doesn't improve. It has limited range to improve. But what the plant can do is produce new growth that is healthy. The old growth is usually the thing that gets algae. And you'll find that in your tanks, most of the new growth will be clean. And the older growth below are the stuff that gets attacked by algae. So what do we do when we have a tank that is like this? I will cut off all the leaves that are the old growth that is affected by algae. For stem plants, sometimes the bottom deteriorates. So I would take the top 2-3 inches, discard the bottom, and then replant the top. And by doing this process continually, over time, just amassing plant mass, it will get to a stage where the tank cleans itself up. So this is where all the growth is adapted to this tank environment. And because the growth is adapted, it's robust enough to defend itself against algae. So this is fighting algae through plant mass. However, for your plants to reach this stage, they need to get everything they require. So for species that require CO2 injection, you need CO2 injection. For species that require higher nutrient levels, you need to provide them the growth parameters. So this is the tank about 8 weeks old, I think. So within 2 months, the tank self-recovers. And for this, I didn't change any parameters. I dose nutrients daily. I didn't use any algicide as well. So this tank healed purely by horticulture work, purely by trimming, replanting, keeping the new growth, discarding the old. It's quite a lot of work for a small tank, but it's one way to solve algae issue without using any additives. And this will work for any tank. But it will only work if you provide what the plants need. So for example, I cannot put in a species that the parameters of the tank doesn't suit. So that plant will be continually stressed and you'll always attract algae. With that same train of thought, if you see a plant that has algae attached, it's also a signal that it's not getting what it needs. Either you are changing your parameters too often, so the plant is trying to keep adapting to the new parameters, or that you are not hitting the minimum requirements that the plant requires. So to summarize this strategy, give the plants what they require. Healthy plants deter algae, and if you have plant mass covering all the surfaces of the tank, and they are all producing these defensive chemicals, you get an algae-free tank. So it sounds easy, but the difficult part, I think, for folks is matching the parameters. So I think that for people with less experience, they may not know what to dose, how much CO2 is required. And the other thing that is tedious is this maximizing healthy growth and removing unhealthy growth. This is a lot of gardening work. But if you do these steps, you can get algae-free tank without the use of any additives. However, this only works for fully planted tanks. So what if you have tanks that are not so fully planted? So that I'll get on to. I want to talk a little bit about Googling for algae problems online, right? So if you Google, you'll find this write-up saying that it's an imbalance or da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So this is not, I'll say that there's a grain of truth in this. It's not entirely rubbish. Why almost all guides say inject more CO2, inject more CO2? That's because CO2 boosts plant growth so much that it generally works across most scenarios, right? But what they are trying to rectify is, it's not that just because you have a high level of CO2, suddenly the algae notices it and runs away. It doesn't work that way. It's because it works through the boosting plant growth. So all the mechanisms of this, whether you have imbalance of phosphate or nitrates or CO2, everything is done as a step to improve plant growth. But if you start with thinking about plant growth, then you don't have to look at any of these algae guides, because all of them lead to the same endpoint, which is trying to get your plant to grow better. So next I want to talk about aquariums that do not have enough plant mass to defend themselves against algae. So this style is very common in Asia. It's called iwagumi, where the aim is to showcase the rocks. And often you'll only see a little bit of carpeting plant. And this tank back at home, I've chosen to do it just with a half carpet. So there's very little plant mass in this tank. So how do you keep such tank algae-free? So if you take a tank that is very sparsely grown, and we treat it the same way we do with a farm tank, we dose a lot of fertilizer, we throw a lot of light at it, what we get is that the plants will grow, but our plants will get green as well. And what we actually want is something like this, where the plant grow, but the rocks are clean. So how do we do this? And the answer is in the top. We will move the nitrogen and phosphate into the substrate, and we'll keep the water column free of it. So the commercial company that has been very successful in this methodology is the ADA. For those of you who are in the planted circle, that name would be very familiar. So what they would use in all this tank is very rich aqua soil, and they'll substrate feed the plants that are rooted, They'll keep the water column level, nutrient levels low, and they also use low light levels. So they can get all these clean rocks, but they can still grow the rooted plants quite nicely. The downside of this method is that if you have pure water column feeders, they will starve. Right? So this method works for stuff that is rooted into the nutrient-rich substrate, but it works very well. So if I was to compare the two methodologies, the plant dominant tank allows me to throw a lot more light and fertilizer on it. So if you look at the tanks that grow difficult species, almost all of them look like this. They will have many different species and the tank will be chock full of plants. This opens the door for more difficult species. If I'm using the method where I just root feed the plants and I don't dose the water column much, I can use also a lot less light because I'm not doing difficult species. And this is the way that they keep the hardscape clean. However, most tanks I find fall in the middle, right? So most of us want some hardscape, then we want our carpets, and we want to add in some colorful plants as well. And the middle is actually the one that is the hardest to balance because you cannot apply just the extremes of both ends. So for the middle, if you throw a huge amount of fertilizer in the water, your rocks will turn green. So it's not as aesthetic. And yet, if you don't dose enough, some of your more picky species may not grow so well. So the middle is the one where I think there's a lot more discretion and consideration. It's the type of tank that is the most common on the market. But this format is actually the hardest. The purists just grow plants all over and just purely substrate feed your plants with low light. These two ends are easy to manage. The one in the middle is difficult. So generally, I would recommend still moving N and P into the substrate. So use aqua soil, root feed your plants nitrogen and phosphate, and try to keep your water column lean. And in this situation, you will also probably be avoiding the most picky plants, because the most picky plants generally do well with a little bit more light, a little bit more water column fertilization. If you try to grow them in such tanks, your hardscape will not be as clean. Yeah. So there are trade-offs in choosing what sort of tank we want. However, can you dose more heavily in a tank that is sparsely planted? This is I think he won the IPLC Aquascaping competition. My company sponsors him, so he uses similar fertilizer to me in our tanks. But in this case, he's using it on a very sparsely planted tank. So how does he get by? And for aquascapers, there are brute force methods. So what he did on this tank is that he did daily water changes for 3 months straight. So that is one way you can escape from algae. For most of these aquascaping competitions, they would use soil in these areas. So for the rooted stem plants, they are a bit more picky. They'll be rooted in soil at the back. They will dose the water column a bit more lean. And they would try to keep it absolutely clean by doing very frequent water changes, either every day or every couple of days. So you can brute force your way through algae as well, but it's quite tedious. Depending on how much plant mass your tank has, after the plants has grown in, you may settle on a less tedious regime. So this is a short quiz for you guys. If I was to rank this tank in terms of plant mass on a scale of 1 to being not planted at all and 10 being fully planted, what would you guys rank this tank? 3, yeah, right. But so I think this was one of the folks that emailed me for advice. So in his description, he writes, "Oh, I have a fully planted tank." Then I look at the picture. I was like, what people think is fully planted is very different from what is needed to mitigate algae by plant mass. So this guy actually has a tank that's very vulnerable to algae because he has so much open space. So this is all free real estate for algae. And yet he's trying to grow red plants, right? So this combination, even though his layout is simple, the choices that he made makes it very difficult. He chose plants that require highlight to show their colors, and yet he has quite a lot of empty space. So what would be his strategy to deal with algae in this case? I would try to grow more plants. I would try to shift the N and P into the substrate a bit. But his substrate is thin as well, right? So this is a difficult starting point, even though the layout is simple. For this tank, on the scale, what will you guys give it? 3? You guys are harsh. Yeah, so again, this person would write us in and say, oh, I have a lot of plants. How do I, why am I having so much algae? Then you see that the sand has turned green. And this guy, or girl, so I'm not sure whose tank this is, they made the difficult choice of using inert substrate. If you use an inert substrate, it means that you need to water feed your plants. If you feed your plants through the water column, you must have enough plant mass to defend your tank. You cannot have open pieces of hardscape where the algae can spawn. And this person does not have the option of moving N and P into the substrate because he is not using soil, right? So this is a very difficult tank to manage. My recommendation would be to just add more plants, go in like a fully planted Dutchscape, but then he will have to give up the nice open spaces of the sand. So there are very strict trade-offs if you want to maintain an algae-free tank. He could also do the brute force method of the aquascapers. So if you water change every 2 days, you could get this algae-free, but then it will be so much work. Oh, this is also where using the soil substrate can make a big difference, right? Because it allows you to shift the N and P into the substrate. The fact that he chose sand doesn't means that the root is not open to him. So this is one of the competition scapes. I think this one scores a bit higher on the planted scale, maybe 7 or 8. And so this, he can do a bit of lean water column fertilization and maybe like 2 water changes a week. And this can be maintained quite well. So for folks that have not tried planting hardscape heavy tanks, these are actually quite easy to maintain. So it's deceptive, right, because of the layout. The only rooted plants that this guy would have will be here, here, and maybe some of the carpet. All these other plants, they are just pasted onto the hardscape, which also means that they are quite easy to remove and cut. Later I'll show you a picture of a scape that I've maintained for like 3 years. So it's one of those complex hardscape, aquascapes as well. Also, this is one I have in the office. Here I use shade plants in the shadow area. And I have a single light that casts higher light for this colored stem bush. So for many of our tank designs, you need not light the tank evenly. You can choose to have uneven lighting. So in here, in this case, I have a spotlight that lights the middle, but the par falls off to like 40, 30 at the edges. So that allows me to keep the sand clean. How about this? Maybe I'll say 7 or 8. Again, the difficult combi that he chose is that he wanted colorful plants together with hardscape. So if he didn't have the colorful plants, the rest of the green plants can be grown with 30 to 40 par. At that light level, it's very easy to keep the rocks clean. For this, I think you need about 80, 90 par to get good color, about 100 if you want them to be dense. So unless you can move your N and P into the substrate, you will have trouble keeping the rocks clean in this example. This is one of the tanks in my office as well. So this tank could be very easily managed if it was not for this single species at the back. So I wanted a touch of color. So I grew like we get Akuta at the back. For that plant to really color up nicely, it needs about 120 par, which is 3 times the amount of light that the rest of the plants require, right? So for the sake of growing just a couple of bunch of red plants, I've raised the light levels in the tank by 3 times. And so I'm getting a bit of green on the substrate and I get a bit of BBA on the wood. So it's a very steep trade-off, this whole growing colorful plants thing. And that's why for most of the commercial aquascapes you see, most of them don't use green plants. And I don't think it's a bad strategy. Like green tanks can be nice as well. With just the green plants, I can keep it at 30 to 40 par. Then algae will be very easy to manage. Another example. See all this free real estate for algae. But he did use soil, so this guy could move N and P into the substrate. But if he wants his red plants to be denser, then he needs quite high light. So this is, again, deceptively a very difficult combination to manage. Like simple layout, difficult choices. So for this, again, I use soil in the surrounding areas. I wanted to show this example because I think it's interesting for those of you who have not done aquascaping. How do you maintain such a steep slope? Right, so this slope at the back is about 8 inches. The front is about 1 inch. So the slope is about like this when you look sideways. And the secret is that this entire slope is super glued down. Yeah, so it takes about half a liter of glue to glue this portion. So basically, we just spray it onto the sand, then we get this solid path. And most of the aquascapes you see online, the competition aquascapes, they have these steep slopes. They are all glued down. Yeah, so I can't plant anything on the path. Yeah, it's just an illusion. There's soil at the side though. So these rocks are what holds up the soil. And again, to keep the rocks clean, I dose the water column more lean. And I root feed the few bunches of plant that require it. I'll leave you guys with this quote about finding information on the internet, that the internet is filled with survivorship biases, right? So I think like one thing a lot of people try to do at home is, oh, can I grow a carpet without CO2? I think it's one of the questions I get the most. And the answer is yes. It's just that it's not a very dependable method. And I think that if you Google to information for picky plant species, there are always outliers to the norm, right? So some people will say that, oh, I can grow aerials in harder water, I can grow colorful plants without CO2. And for those few examples, it works. But I think that unless you can really narrow down the parameters, for many of them, the success rates are not high. And the rare successes make great social media posts. Yeah. So I was also guilty of this in the past. If you look back old YouTube videos and you Google how to grow a carpet without CO2, you might come across my videos. So I've demonstrated growing, I think, all the carpets that are available in commercial trade without CO2. But trying to pass on the method to others, then I realized that, oh, the failure rate is about 95%. Most people don't get enough of the parameters correct for it to work well. So this is a warning about trying to search for information on the internet. With that, I thank you for your time. Yep. And I'll take questions. Yes.
So I had done the research and purchased the ADA aqua soil, the Amazonia thing that would last longer and I wouldn't have to use root.
Yes.
I purchased your ABT jazz.
Yeah.
So I've got the tank's now a year old.
Okay.
At what point do you start root tapping if you think you have a good aqua soil?
I think that the quality of aqua soil, the richness, has diminished over time because hobbies nowadays, they are impatient. So if you have a rich aqua soil, it takes longer to settle, and you get a lot of milting and algae issues for the initial months. So most commercial producers produce leaner soils nowadays. Unfortunately, it doesn't cater to people that want rich soil. I think that if you're using the version 2, about 3 to 4 months in, you start to see the downslope. For most other brands, you see the downslope after the first month. Yeah, and I think the downslope comes so fast that some aquarists that use aqua soil nowadays, like those of you using fluvostratum, what else is common here? So I don't know about contra soil, but like fluvostratum, I think the cliff comes after the first month. So some folks feedback like, what's the point of using aqua soil? I don't see the benefits of it. But that's because these soils are all quite weak. Yeah. ADA version 2 goes down slope in about 3 to 4 months. Yeah.
So if I'm seeing deterioration in some of my stem plants, or not doing as well as I should.
Well, it depends on what level of optimality you are aiming for. I think that for the first 8 months, the soil helps. But if you're trying to grow the fattest plants possible, then you start to see a bit of the dip after 3 to 4 months. Yeah. Yes, yes,
So you talked about the different forms of nitrogen.
yes.
And so when using root tabs, do you prefer to use something like ammonium nitrate or do you use potassium nitrate? And what do you think about the argument that potassium is the same diameter as ammonia, and so it takes up the space, the binding space in the soil for
I have not tested ammonium nitrate in the soil yet, but I know that for almost all species of aquatic plants, they have the shoot preference uptake for potassium. That means that as long as you are dosing some potassium into your water column, generally the plants uptake it very easily from the water, so there's no need to have it in the soil. Coming back to your question, you can refresh your aqua soil grains by soaking them in a solution of like ammonium sulfate, ammonium nitrate, or what was yours?
was potassium nitrate the other words I said.
Or potassium nitrate. No, sorry, the soil doesn't bind to the nitrates, so you need an ammonia source. Yeah, the soil particles bind ammonia, but not nitrate. Yeah, so potassium nitrate wouldn't work. You need ammonium sulfate or ammonium phosphate or ammonium nitrate, but the nitrate portion would leach into your water column. Yeah.
Thank you.
The other chemical that you could try is urea, but urea requires the biological enzyme in the substrate to convert it to ammonia, so there can be a time lag. Yeah, which is not a bad thing, right? So if you use our root tabs, there's a mix of urea and ammonium sulfate. Yeah.
Best resource for finding out what parameters plants need.
So that is the difficult question to answer. No, it's also an easy question to answer. Because if you follow the parameters that I put on my slides, you can grow any species. I haven't found a species that cannot grow within those parameters. Yeah. So the online information is virtually all wrong. Yeah. So some of them are taken from biological studies of the natural water, which may not. The fact that the plant grows that way in the nature doesn't mean it is what it prefers. Yeah. So which parameter are you asking about specifically?
I was just
Yeah.
thinking in general as a good resource for things.
If you copy that one slide from my presentation, you can grow everything. Basically, it's this one. Yeah, this slide. So if you have generally soft water and a little bit more hardness, the pH doesn't matter. Like between 4 to 7 is a huge range. Very normal temperature ranges, Yeah. So this is the main one. Most of the picky species require a low KH. Everything else is more flexible. Yeah, plants are a lot easier in that sense. Yes.
Do you feel that's the case even for some of the hard water plants? So for example, Valtriptera, I grows like a weed for me in my high.
Oh, so there are some outliers. So that falls under the 0.1%. Yeah. Some of the valves, Rotala Sunset,
Yeah.
Pogostomon helferi, but it's literally this handful that, yeah.
Also just dying.
Yeah. So short of that, this small handful of plants, everything works well in this range. Yeah.
If you find that your FAR is low around 1, or maybe you're even like 70 or 80,
Okay.
but you want to get more red and you need to go to 150,
Yes.
is there a danger that you're going to kill everything else or cause an algae spike? Or how
No.
do you
The only
raise it up?
the only downside is algae, I think. Yeah.
Should you ramp it up slowly or how does that work?
You can ramp it up slowly across a couple of weeks. Yeah. And also choose the light that renders colors well. Yeah.
So I've been recommended for Goose recently to cut white entirely.
Okay.
Like do 100% red, 60%
Yeah.
blue, and
Yes.
10% green.
Yes.
Is that silly or
No.
is that a big tactic?
So that what that does for your kind of light is that it gives a better color rendition. The white actually washes it out by giving it more mid-tones. So that's the way those lighting sets work. But you can grow it perfectly well with just RGB. Yeah, so all my tanks here, so this is grown on fluorescent, but virtually every other tank, every other plant you see is grown using that format. Yeah. To give a bit more depth to your question, if you're looking for pure vegetative yield, like you're a farmer and looking for the maximum growth point, then using the whites would add into that, right? Because it widens the spectrum a bit. But I think for most of us, we are not farming for the sake of,
Well, I
yeah.
found that for my boosts, I can see coloration starting within days.
Yeah.
But for stem plants, they actually grow much slower than in my high white light tanks. But the color is phenomenal. But
Yes.
tanks all
Yeah.
so-
Plants do take a bit of time to adapt to the new spectrum. Because for the lights that, the new LED lights on the market, how they work is that they have no white spectrum. They just have a narrow spectrum spike in red, green, and blue. So if you see it on a spectrograph, there's one LED at like, I think it's 220, one in the green spike and one at 420. So very narrow spectrum spikes. And I think it takes the plant a while to adapt if you switch between light systems. I think it could take a couple of weeks, at least. Yeah. Yes? Yeah.